Um, so this last panel of the day is called Teaching Labor Unions and Collectives. And we have a bunch of really interesting panelists for us. I'm just going to give very brief introductions. For 25 years, May Chen was a labor organizer for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the unions that followed from it. Since 2009, she has taught in the Labor Studies program at the City University of New York. Historian David Witwer and writer-filmmaker Catherine Rios are professors at Penn State Harrisburg and the co-authors of the 2020 book Murder in the Garment District, a reconsideration of the role of the mafia in the garment industry. Professor Rios is currently adapting it as a screenplay. And Lara, I am so sorry I didn't ask you how to pronounce the last name before this, but I'm guessing it's Kisielewska. Am I close? Maybe I'm not. Is a graphic artist and entrepreneur, the founder and co-founder of several firms and magazines related to graphic art and marketing: Optimum Design and Consulting, Solaraka Partners, Xand Marketing, Linux, I guess it's pronounced Linux Magazine, and VoiceOver IP Magazine. She is also president of the Graphic Artists Guild, a trade association of graphic artists. So I'm going to jump in and ask you all the first question, which is, tell us a little bit about your work and how it relates to unions or trade associations of artists, designers, and other workers. May, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to this symposium. It's been really interesting to sit in on some of the sessions.
Thanks.
Yeah, I work for the what was originally the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, starting for 25 years. And of course, because of the changes in the industry, the union merged and changed names and so on. But in my local, the union members were production workers in the sewing factories. There were some sample makers, and there were mostly immigrant women. So although I worked in the more industrial side of the fashion industry, I found that the workers there were thousands of workers, had a lot of skill, interest, and pride in the fashion industry and in their work. They really loved clothes, and they often made their own clothes for themselves and their kids. And whenever we went to labor events together, they were always complimented about being so well dressed. So yeah, so there was kind of the intersection of art and industry. And after I retired from the union in 2009, I taught part-time as an adjunct in the labor studies program at CUNY.
Thanks. Catherine, you want to go next?
Sure, yeah, I'm Catherine Rios. I'm kind of an anomaly. I'm a screenwriter, so my work as it relates to the portrayal of workers and the fashion industry is really about representations of garment workers and workers in general in pop culture. So like in films and TV, and when I teach, we will address some of those issues of representation, but in my work, and I've been partnering with David, who's also my husband, for some time. His work is like, just like so rich in terms of its research and exploring, the origins of corruption in labor organizations. These are just fabulous stories. And as a filmmaker, a lot of the stories that depict labor and labor conflict revolve around, male industries like the car industry and mine workers industry. And I find that the conflicts that workers in the garment industry face are not depicted as frequently or at all in popular media. And those have huge impact on public perception of what the nature of these conflicts and struggles are for workers. So, it's really important to me to be a person who can depict kind of research-based stories about those struggles. And then I would add too, like I actually have a Bachelor of Fine Arts from RISD in glass. So my early career was in the fine arts career studios, independent studios, and working in the independent studio system with all of the labor limitations that you find in those situations. So I have some experience in that realm too.
Thanks. David, why don't you go next?
Okay, great. First of all, thank you so much for inviting us, and thanks for organizing this great conference. And I too have really enjoyed jumping in sessions that are quite beyond my usual realm. So yeah, I'm a labor historian, and basically I've written a series of books. My first one was on the history of the Teamsters Union, which in addition to being the largest union, always had the worst reputation for corruption. And so my first book was just to sort of study the occupation of being a Teamster, which back in old days was driving a horse and wagon, and the nature of the business and the occupation, and then the links between that and that reputation for corruption. And so the first book was really about the sort of institutional forces that lead to issues of corruption and workers' efforts or to their desire to get something quite different from the union. And then what I found was there was these sort of basic set of forces in an industry and in an occupation that might lead to problems with a union. And those were fairly constant. But then I saw these moments where there would be waves of concern about corruption. And so essentially, this is a long-winded way of saying, what I've come to focus on is a kind of a labor history of the issue of corruption and its reputation that gets tagged to unions. And what I've come to see is the way in which this is oftentimes the product of political forces that are opposed to union power and concerned about essentially the ways in which workers are using unions to change the nature of the power dynamic. So two books follow, and the most recent one is what Dan cited, right, which is Murder in the Garment District, which focuses on the garment district in 1950s, the post-World War II era, and the way in which a very progressive union, the Ladies Garment Workers Union, found itself having to confront an organized crime group that was entrenched in the industry and that was abetted by corrupt New York City police and basically indifferent federal law enforcement. And what we really tried to do in the book, and then I'll shut up because I feel like I'm going a little bit long at 4 p.m. here. What we really tried to do in the book was sort of talk about the way in which the nature of the garment industry created forces that tended to encourage corruption and gave a role to organized crime. And what we also tried to focus on, and Catherine talked about this, right, was the way in which this affects the day-to-day existence of the workers in the garment industry, the women at the sewing machines, in both in the garment district, but also in Northeast Pennsylvania and other places where the contractor shops were spread. Yeah, I think that's all I need to say for now, and probably more than what I need to say.
Well, that was great. Thank you. Lara. Still muted.
There we go. Sorry. I come at this from a bit of a different perspective. I started a graphic design firm 29 years ago, and I instantly knew that, there was that thing, you don't know what you don't know. And since I was so young, I knew that there was plenty that I didn't know. And I reached out to the Graphic Artists Guild and joined within a few months of starting my business. And I've been a very active member ever since, including 4 years as chapter president in New York chapter, but I've been on the national board of the Graphic Artists Guild continuously since 1998. And I spent 6 years as secretary, 6 years as vice president, and I'm now at the end of my 4th year as president with the intention to rerun for 1 more 2-year term, and then I'll get termed out. So I'm kind of a lifer, but I've realized that it's really integral to my why. And when I started my business, first of all, it was 1992, so there was no World Wide Web where you could go look stuff up. And there just really weren't resources. And when I graduated, I had art skills, but no business skills. And the mission statement of the Graphic Artists Guild is to promote and protect the economic interest of the artist and make sure that they know about copyright and contracts and empower them to understand how to negotiate properly and what fair pricing is all about and what the good business practices are. And because I didn't know those things initially, I made a lot of mistakes that were very damaging for decades, like some pretty bad financial mistakes. And it really bothered me later in life that I was not at the same place financially that some of my peers were who went out and got a staff job. And it really became important to me to share all the things that I learned, my story, and all the mistakes I made as a guide to prevent other artists coming up from making the same mistakes. And it made it feel better to me. Like if I could spend some of my time helping other people to avoid these mistakes, then it made it worthwhile as to why I had to go through it. So I've realized through the course of my career that my why for why I started my business and like what keeps me going is not really my business as much as it is being so active with the guild. And I wouldn't be able to be as active with the guild if I wasn't a business owner, but the guild is really more centrally tied into my why than what the business was in the first place. And the guild does have some connection to labor union, although not formally. We started out, our origin story, we started out as a protest in Detroit against unfair practices that advertising agencies were putting forth against their studio artists. And there was a prominent illustrator of the time, Martin C. Anderson. He organized a protest against the studios, which led to demonstrations of graphic artists with signs and posters and parades down the streets of Detroit and a letter writing campaign. And Martin had this dream that graphic artists everywhere, not just in Detroit, but everywhere, would be able to control their work and thrive. So he and a core group of activists decided they were going to form a union. And in 1967, the Independent National Guild and the local guild branch or chapter in Detroit had 113 initial members who signed a charter. And the Graphic Artists Guild Constitution is actually patterned after that of the Screen Actors Guild. So while we have evolved and we switched to a trade association some years ago, we've always had roots in artists' rights and in helping protect the artist's ability to make a living. And so we have a very active advocacy arm, and we are down in Capitol Hill all the time. We have actively helped to change law to the betterment of graphic artists. And while we offer a lot of the same kinds of things that a professional organization offers in terms of educating members and, talking about best practices, the fact that we engage on this very nitty-gritty level with advocacy and, trying to change laws is really what makes us a trade association rather than a professional organization.
Thanks. Can you tell us a little bit more about a law or two that you've gotten passed?
Yeah, absolutely. So the one that I'm super, super proud of and is quite recent is the CASE Act. And I don't know if this is something that you guys are familiar with at all, but copyright is a really onerous thing to try and go to court about, right? So you have all these huge corporations who will rip off the work of some artist. They'll just grab it off the internet and use it. And the artist says, hey, that's mine. They're not really going to do anything about it. They're like, okay, fine, sue me. They know that the smaller artist doesn't have the ability to go to court. There's no financial resources to go and sue for copyright infringement. So most of the time what happens is they get to settle it for some small amount, or they just ignore it altogether. So the CASE Act is for like a small claims court set up just for copyright. In most states, small claims court is limited at like $2,000 or $5,000. But this act allows for artists to have 2 infringement cases of $15,000 each, so $30,000 total per year, where they can sue the corporation that's infringing. And the idea was that was a large enough number to have teeth. It's very easy for the artist to do. They don't need a lot of financial resources. It's just like going to small claims court, but they can have these much larger claims. And so it allows artists to sort of take the ability to control or have more recourse if they are going to be infringed upon. And that was something that we worked on for like literally a decade. We kept moving it through Congress, and then like something would happen and the Congress would flip to the next Congress and we'd have to start all over again. And it passed in December. But when we were lobbying in Congress, we found our most effective tool was our members. So like graphic designers and illustrators who actually had their work ripped off by copyright infringers, they contacted their representatives, their senators, huge letter writing campaigns, individual personalized letters. They came to DC. We showed up in force in the offices of these different members. We had a huge shaming campaign, because at one point we had everybody except one senator on board, and a senator from Oregon was against it. And we put these huge billboards up to shame him. And he finally came on board. So like, this was a very specific, tangible thing that we did that is now better for artists everywhere.
That's great. Thank you.
I have to say, we didn't solely do it. We were in conjunction with other arts organizations out there, but we had a huge piece of it for sure.
It's terrific. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on to the second question. What do you all think that college students, and in particular art and design college students, ought to learn in school about either trade associations or labor unions? David, I'll start you off this time.
All right, good. I don't teach art and design students, but I'll tell you what I think college students that I teach, and I've been teaching for about 25 years, should know. And they should know that unions emerged out of historical changes that really changed the nature of work. And they changed the nature of the ability of the worker to control the pace of work and the environment of work. And that really radically altered the balance of power. And they should know how unions emerged and then how they tried to help to shape the modern workplace, both in the sort of formal rules that we now have, right? The 40-hour week and the expectation of an 8-hour day and paid vacation and stuff like that. But also that notion of work rule expectations and just the balance of power. And I suppose, like, if I were up on my soapbox talking about it, right, I'd say even in those moments where unions are at their peak in the U.S., right, they're still a minority of the workforce, which is, you know, what, in the 1950s, a peak of, say, about a third of the workforce. But the notion is they exert so much influence, and those employers that don't want their workers to join unions, which is the majority of employers in the U.S., they feel they have to sort of match the benefits or the terms and conditions that unions win. And so they tend to have a larger influence than their share of the workforce. And then I suppose, you know, if you were asking me, what do I think that workers or students in the Fashion Institute of Technology might want to know, or in related fields, right? I feel that they might want to know about the history of the garment industry and about the struggle of unions within that industry going back to the 1800s and then progressing through, to try to moderate the worst tendencies of an industry where competition has always sort of led to the worst possible conditions for workers. So the sort of level of cutthroat competition has shaped the workplace. And Catherine and I were just at a book talk at the Center for Global Worker Rights at Penn State just last week. And one of the things that we talked about is just the sort of the shift that's occurred historically, where what we talked about in our book is the nature of the garment industry and the work conditions and the cutthroat competition in the business, say in 1950s and 1960s in New York City's garment industry, but the way that has now flowed out into a sort of global atmosphere, right? So as those factories have moved to the South in the US and then offshore to Mexico and now, of course, to South Asia, then also you can sort of see that in terms of a global pattern. And so I'm almost done here, but I would say this is that as an historian, as a history professor, I always want my students to see the roots of the current condition and the current world in that past. I want them to see the tangible connections. And to the extent those tangible connections affect the workplace and the workplace is related to the larger economic situation, that's what I want them to know.
All right, thanks. May, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I was very taken with Lara's example about collective strength leading after 10 years to passing a law. And I think that college students need to learn, well, I think they need to learn the economic context in which they're going to enter a job market after college, especially college students who are in the arts and spend so much time zoned in on the art, the techniques, the skills, and all that kind of stuff, but understanding that broader context. Because when I was in the union, we did work with new designers who really needed to get that economic training about what the business side of the industry was going to be. And they, were able to design beautiful things, but they didn't know much about business or advocacy. So I think advocacy is another thing students should learn about. Kind of the politics of life, you could say, that, you know, it's not the ivory tower. And then lastly, I think that the colleges and universities don't teach a real appreciation for workers. A lot of times, you know, colleges have this elitist approach to learning that leads students to really look down on workers, even in their own campuses. So I think that there needs to be a way for college students to have that respect for workers. Many times their parents also were workers, and the kids don't respect their parents for that because they just feel like they were lowlifes or, you know, not deserving of respect. So I think that appreciation for workers is very important.
Thanks. Lara, do you want to go next?
I think that it's very important for students or anybody entering the labor market to understand that at a very basic level, there's a push and pull between corporate interest and worker interest. By workers, you know, everyone, including like me, like small design firm, but, you know, as opposed to a huge corporate interest. And so there's a lot of new technologies that are disrupting old business models right now, like Lyft and Uber replacing taxis, Airbnb replacing hotels, et cetera. So it seems that workers need to find a new labor model to represent themselves. And there's a shift right now, I think, in the power dynamic, so that creative workforce, like people who are working as independent contractors, are realizing that they can have a voice against things like abusive contracts and copyright grabs and other abusive practices. And this is social media has helped to empower individuals to feel like they have a collective voice. And that's something new that technology has brought to the table. But trade associations and unions and other forms of collective workers have always shown the power of the collective voice. And it's right now, like last week, what's happened is that McGraw-Hill, which is a global textbook publisher, is now charging 2.2% off of every invoice that their freelancers submit to them. So writers, designers, everybody, they now have to pay 2.2% of what they're going to charge just so McGraw-Hill can process their invoice. I mean, it's ridiculous. They're taking this cost of new invoice processing software and passing it on to workers, which is awful. And they're the first one to do it, and hopefully nobody will jump on the bandwagon. But this is something that we and other creative organizations have jumped on right away. And I think we live now in a world, especially after the past year, where students are becoming much more aware that a collective voice can work. You know, there are protests and things actually happen. I think this generation seems to be more questioning and less just simply accepting of the idea that, you know, well, this is life. They're more about, well, what can we do about it? And in previous years, it seemed like there was more of a, like, I can do it alone attitude. And students nowadays, they're questioning the power dynamic, and they're more aware that a collective voice can do something. And so they can see an organization trying to do something and sign on and be like, yeah, I'm going to add my voice to that. And they realize that they can actually make a difference. So I think it's important to show examples of ways that they can join some kind of organization who is advocating for them and actually help affect change that really impacts their bottom line, their ability to make a living.
Thanks. Catherine?
Yeah, okay, sure. So the two areas that I can speak on are, one, in the area of representation and the depiction of workers and the depiction of worker conflicts. And then two, I also teach design thinking classes in which, you know, in both sides of it, the thing that college students need to be able to understand and what we can offer for them are lessons about the implications and consequences of decisions. Like if you go back and you look at the historical experience of workers, like through historical research, but then you're crafting a story to communicate to a mainstream kind of general audience who may not be interested in the intricacies of labor, but they're interested in the struggles of people. And so the idea that really kind of communicating what the implications of decisions are, like the design decisions as an independent artist, when you design certain features in your garment, what does that actually mean for the workers who have to produce that garment? And in design thinking, like, I teach a design thinking class, and we can actually use case studies to kind of reverse engineer. And in fact, manufacturers and brands are using, and independent artists are using the storytelling tools of, social media to tell the story of their brand and tell the story of how their brand fulfills certain expectations about sustainability or best practices in labor. And students can, if they're taught more of a historical perspective about where some of these issues kind of originated in the industry and what the implications of some of these decisions actually are for workers, then they know how to use those tools in the present tense with the tools that are available to them in terms of presenting their own, approaching their own design in a certain way, or their own career within design in a certain way. So, I feel like some of the things that students need to know, college students, is they need to be taught about the implications of, entering into a certain corporate position, or entering into, designing things in a certain way. And for me, that starts with telling the stories of that implication, telling the stories about how, these corruption is systemic. When you look at stories that are told in terms of film has a protagonist, it's a hero that goes off and it overcomes an obstacle, and it wins or loses, and it's driven by an individual. But if the stories can tell about the systemic forces that are shaping some of those consequences, then I think people can become more sensitive and aware of what is happening for actual workers in the world. And, in terms of garment and fashion, some of the implications of those forces on actual individuals, on actual humans. And that's my realm, is the storytelling realm. So I stay over there.
Thanks. I actually want to stay with you, Catherine, for the next question. What are negative stereotypes about unions or trade associations that you think college students need to be disabused of?
I think, personally, college students need to be disabused of the impression of union members as activists, as activists as a negative connotation. That there's kind of an extreme position that's associated with union activism that actually is false. It's actually like people who are pursuing solid working conditions and sustainable business practices are not extreme. That should be the norm. And it would be if we would quit casting the story in terms of extremes, in terms of the heroic activist who solves a problem. There's a way of telling that story where you can talk about the collective good and social unionism, striving for better, just basic human rights in labor, and not as an extreme outlier of like a radical position. I think I can let somebody else talk, but that's my position.
All right, great. David, do you want to go next on that? Still muted.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So I was just going to loop around and kind of respond also to what May was saying, was just that the sort of reference to like an unfamiliarity of our college students with work and with workers. And that may be true at maybe, I'll use a Hoosierism here, at maybe more highfalutin institutions, but at Penn State Harrisburg, which is where we teach, our students a high proportion of them are first generation college. And quite frankly, they're quite often working their way through college, and they've done summer jobs. And so So they're very much aware of the world of workers, which is where they come from. This doesn't mean that they're familiar with unions. Quite often they're not. And quite often what they know about unions, we sort of talked about this in the opening of our book, they know about it through the orientation program that they get when they get hired at Target or at Walmart or one of the other large corporations. And that's an orientation program where they essentially learn that unions are outdated, because essentially all the protections that workers need are now enshrined in law. And so they're really unnecessary fees that you would pay. And they tap into the sort of long tradition of depicting unions as corrupt. And so to the extent that the students that we have encounter anything about unions, they encounter either through these kinds of, this becomes for them the kind of labor history that they know, or they learn it through popular culture like the movie The Irishman, right, which essentially depicts a union as really no more than just another form of organized crime. And so I think that stereotype of unions as no longer serving a useful purpose, and to the extent that they still linger around, they're largely corrupt. I think that's the negative misconception or stereotype that needs to be corrected.
Thanks. May?
Yeah, I think a lot of the negative stereotypes, especially when I was involved in union organizing drives, was this idea that the union is some outside organization, bureaucratic, bullying, that just wants to take the workers' dues. And so I think that we always had a big struggle to work with committees of workers to understand that the workers are the union, which is, a very idealistic thing to say, but to really organize the teamwork capacity of the workers to influence and to move the union policy along. So I think for colleges, I think there's kind of an inherent bias in college curriculum that emphasizes capitalistic goals like how to make money and how to cut out other rivals in order to make this money and, compete and so on. And there's nothing wrong with making money because the unions want workers to make a decent living. But I think that there needs to be more education on on organizing for collective goals. And I'm also very encouraged to see, a real upswing of civic organizing on all these different topics. And I think that's very positive. I think the colleges, what they can do to inform and enhance and move that forward would help to inform this idea of what are unions at their essence.
Thanks. So, Lara, I think it's a little different for you because unions have negative stereotypes and trade associations have no stereotypes. Am I wrong about that? Oh, you're still muted.
That's very strange because I didn't go and mute myself. Maybe the same thing happened with David. We, over the years, have changed our messaging. We used to very proudly say that we are just like a labor union. We advocate for artists' rights just like a labor union does, even though we're not an official union. But there are negative stereotypes, which we've just been hearing about, and anti-labor forces have been very effective at presenting unions corrupt, bloated, self-serving, etc. And we realized over the years that it's better to not lead with that messaging. I think in the 70s and 80s, it was much more effective to draw people in. And I think the word advocacy is more commonly heard now. People are more aware of what that means. And so saying that we're going to advocate for your rights on Capitol Hill and we're going to, help change laws to be more favorable to graphic artists is something that will resonate with them. Even though that's what a union might have done, we can talk about, what good comes out of collective voices without using that word, because it is a very charged word. And we've lost some members out of their perceptions of what a union is or isn't back in the day. So I think it is important to talk about the power of collective voices, but we don't need to use the word union to talk about that. And so we don't anymore, although we used to.
I want to switch to another question now. We talked about this a little bit already, and you guys were enthusiastic to talk about it when we talked last week. So I want to raise again the question of popular images of unions and maybe trade associations also. I was thinking about all of the movies that I know about unions, and there's sort of two big categories. One, that they're really corrupt. Two, really earnest movies about people overcoming adversity and creating the union. And the only movie I could think of that doesn't really fall into either of those categories, which I personally think is the best pro-labor movie ever made, is Sorry to Bother You, which came out a couple of years ago. And it's sort of this bizarre sci-fi union organizing movie. It's very hard to categorize. But I was wondering what all of you thought, whether there are areas in popular culture that you think are very supportive of unions, where are the problems, and is this an area that we need to work on in order to reach out to those college students through pop culture? Catherine, you're the movie maker. You want to go first? Oh, you're muted again. Maybe people are muting you, unmuting
I'm
you.
sorry. Yeah, that's great. Sorry to Bother You is a great and fabulously weird movie. But I felt like it was really honest in terms of worker experience. So yeah, I mean, in pop culture, in like film and movies and television, I mean, one, we have like, you know, this tradition of the feature film, and the feature film is built around a central hero who is trying to achieve and confront an obstacle. And so when depictions of labor conflicts are represented, the success or the overcoming of the conflict is driven by the initiative of a single hero with a single motive. You know, like it's that person's unique strength and capacity that overcomes this obstacle. And usually, if you look at films that achieve like a popular status that depict labor, they usually are set in a so-called masculine industry, like the mine workers or like the Teamsters or you know, any other male-dominated kind of industries. And I think that there's a certain stereotypes that are at play in those industry, you know, in those depictions where they want to tell a story about a struggle. They want to tell a story about a struggle, and they want to tell the story through the lens of a first-person protagonist, you know, one person driving the action and being the hero and overcoming the obstacles. However, because of the nature of media now, we have emerging genres kind of coming through streaming, and the way people view content through streaming, where you have the capacity to tell stories that are more systemic and nuanced, where they have multiple forces at play, working, you know, kind of in tandem and impacting action in the film and the stories together, like, because it's a story that happens over time. So we finally have this capacity to tell stories that can be more nuanced and can be more complex, with multiple forces shaping the action instead of a single protagonist striving to overcome an obstacle. And I think that's good for the kinds of stories that can be told about labor, because there are definitely individuals that are heroic in labor conflicts and the stories about labor. But usually, you know, there are systemic forces involved. It's not something that can be solved by one person fighting the man and overcoming one labor conflict. It's something that has to be dealt with systemically. And so those stories can start to be told. And all the different layers of consequences can be articulated better too in these new forms. Additionally, the way people tell stories about themselves, the way unions tell stories about themselves has changed too, because they can engage with the audience directly through their social media and their media presence. And people are leveraging that. They're telling stories about, you know, their own role in the economy. you know, and that can help change the narrative about what unions are and about the stereotypes that drive unions. So I think there's a real opportunity right now because viewing habits are changing for popular media like movies and television, which favor long form stories, which favor complex stories like in labor, and also the power to present different representations of workers is really strong right now because people have access to audiences directly through their own social media channels. And together, those things can really start to change the narrative. Like the fact that The Irishman is a story, this is something that bugs the heck out of me. Stories about labor are almost always told through the lens of a criminal's perspective. But what about the implications for real life people who are having, you know, the catastrophic impact on their lives? Those are the same kinds of life and death kind of situations that you might find in a criminal story, but because of who's making the films and the type of formula that's usually followed for films, it's almost always told from some extreme point of view rather than a more systemic point of view. I hope that kind of addresses your question.
Yeah, and what you're making me think about is the TV show The Wire, because I think on the one hand, The Wire is terrific at showing systemic problems.
Yeah.
And sort of the dynamic of it, for those of you who haven't seen it, is there is this one character, McNulty, who thinks that he's the protagonist of the TV show. And the show is constantly undermining his belief that he is that protagonist.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet, when they deal with the labor movement in the second season, it has all of the mistakes that you're pointing out. There is a single labor leader who is trying heroically to save his union. There's the connection to corruption and the, you know, the crime and mobbed upness of it. And so, you know, to me, the treatment of labor and unions in The Wire is like the one real misstep that a TV show makes. And it's
Yeah, I would agree. And that show is one of the early shows that was able to tell a complex systemic, address a complex systemic issues by kind of passing the baton of the subject from one season to the next, instead of having this singular focus on one character, one set of characters that drove all the action. And that's a real opportunity for addressing some of the, you know, we should be seeing more representations of power and impact in especially, you know, it's rich, like the fashion industry is rich with stories like this.
Yeah, you're making me think we need a Wire for the fashion industry, where the first
Well,
season
I'm working on it.
designers to draw you in, sucker
Well,
you
look
in.
at how rich it is. Like there's issues of craft. Like none of these films ever or stories ever actually address like the heritage or legacy of craft that's involved. You know, what the role of the consumer and the desire of like what it means to want to partake in fashion. You know, what the consumer is motivated or the impact on consumer. None of those things are ever addressed, yet they are rich storylines.
Yeah. David, do you want to jump in on this subject? Muted again. I think we're automatically muting people when.
Yeah, we are automatically muting. That's fine. Yeah, I mean, I think Catherine really covered the notion of movies and TV shows really well. I guess again, I'll circle back to what May was saying in the sense that you know, historically, what we used to have in addition to the movies and TV is maybe a different kind of news media that was more willing to cover workers and workers' concerns and workers' issues. And so I did this journal article a few years ago about the labor beat, which was this notion beginning in the 1930s and 1940s. You know, news magazines like Time or Newsweek and newspapers like the New York Times, but AP and UP, they all had reporters who were devoted to covering the concerns of workers. And this was more than just unions, right? The notion, the idea of the labor beat wasn't that you would just swoop in when there was a strike and say, here's this issue, the employers say A and the workers in the union say B, is that you would cover the workers in the industry in such a way that when strikes occurred, people would understand the context of what was going on. And what I talked about in the article, and I'm not the only person who recognizes that kind of journalism, which, you know, I think the best representative of it that any of us can think of off the top of our head would be someone like Studs Terkel. That has kind of faded away. And so now, to the extent that you talk about workers or unions in the news media, you only talk about them in the business section, and you only talk about it when there's a strike or the threat of a strike. And so that right there changes the very nature of how people understand both what workers are about, right? But also what the organizations of workers are about. And I think that's a problem maybe as big as the movies or TV in terms of people's understanding of it.
Thanks. May?
Yeah, I'm not a big movie or TV buff, but so I think one of my favorite labor movies was Norma Ray because it had a female protagonist, but I totally get the thing about one person saving the world and that being a little bit unreal. I actually have more of and I'm excited that at the prospect that we could have new Studs Terkel like stories, in the current pop media. That would be fantastic. I love that stuff. I had more of a question to my co-panelist, which is the film Nomadland. Is that a labor film or is it not? And I thought that the portrayal of people working was very real and just their day-to-day life and the way they talked about it. But it didn't particularly take it to another level. So what did you all think of that?
I haven't seen it. I'm saving it for summer.
Okay.
I saw it, and I think that's a fascinating interpretation. I also see it as a movie about geology. There are so many rocks in that movie and about sort of the landscape and how it shapes reality and life. That's fascinating. I'll keep thinking about that. Lara, do you want to say anything on this subject?
It's not really a subject I've spent time dwelling on. I having my own thoughts as you listening to everyone here. I'm thinking about the fact that I grew up with a very positive impression of unions because my parents are both teachers. So I think it really depends on how you grow up and what kind of family you grew up into, because most people's impression of unions are shaped there, even sometimes before pop culture. And you're right. Everybody who's been seeing it is very. There is the characteristic of a union. Like when people draw caricatures, the caricature of a union is like everybody said it is. But it didn't even occur to me that what helped my parents do as well as they could was the same thing. Like it was so different. So I think it depends where you are. And if we're going to generalize about how to depict unions, maybe we should, in this days of segmented messaging, figure out how to give different messages to different groups of people who already have their own preconceived ideas of what it is.
So we have time for some questions from the audience. So if anybody's got a question, please put it in the chat. But while we're waiting for you, I will ask one more question. And I want to start with Lara. What are the relative advantages to creative workers of joining a union versus a non-union organization like a trade association?
Well, we're not actually aware of unions for graphic artists apart from IATSE, which is the, I can't remember what it stands for, the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, Moving Picture Technicians, Artists, and Allied Crafts. Sorry, I just went and looked that up. I mean, there are other unions like the National Writers Union, which represents writers, but unless there's some small union I'm not aware of, and you're going out into graphic arts professions, you're really looking to join a professional association like the AIGA or a trade association like the Guild. There isn't really a union options to compare that something would be better or not better. I feel like as long as you're the reason a lot of people will ask, like, well, what's the difference between the Graphic Artists Guild and the AIGA, which is the much larger, well-known association for graphic artists? And I always feel like the main difference comes down to the advocacy arm that the Guild has, and the fact that we are a trade association specifically so we can go out and do the nitty-gritty kind of advocacy work that we do. And the very simplistic way of saying it is that, the AIGA is about the art and the Graphic Artists Guild is about the artist. We are focused on who you are as an artist. We don't care at what skill level you have, or, how famous you are, or how much money you make from your work. We just want to make sure that you understand how to make a living at your art and how to behave in an ethical way in the graphic artist environment. We want to educate both the artist and the consumer about the right way to purchase graphic art and interact in a good business relationship. So I think that that is of value to everybody, whether you are going into the industry, whether you've been around for a while, or whether you're purchasing from the industry. And I don't know that you need to choose between whether that's more or less important than whether there might be a union, or whether you're also going to be part of the AIGA and, get involved with like really high-end design work. I think there's room for all of it. I think the important thing is to make sure that that students specifically coming into the field are aware that these things exist and what they can do for them. We have a student membership which is really low, and we make sure to front load as many resources as we can. It's in our best interest to make sure that students come into the field understanding about copyright and contracts and what they should be pricing. Because if students go out and price themselves under market, they're creating all this market confusion out there for people who can look at, a professional graphic artist and say, well, why are you charging $2,000 for this logo? Here's this person charging $200 for it, or here's this company charging $20,000 for it. It's really confusing for people to know, what things should cost. So the more work we can do to educate students about fair pricing for their work, for example, which is critical, the better it is for everybody in the industry. And I feel like it's the best thing to do is to make sure that students are aware that learning doesn't stop after college. It's important to join a professional association or a trade association or a union and just keep learning about your industry and how to be better at it and more effective at it. And then if you're interested, get involved and help change, the tax laws, the labor laws, all the laws in your favor.
I think this is very interesting because you're talking about teaching students to negotiate better on their own behalf for ultimately better wages, better money, whereas a union would collectively bargain on behalf of those same individuals. And I just don't know which would end up being more successful in the long run.
We're not allowed to have collective bargaining. In fact, there's a new law that just passed the House called the PRO Act, which does provide for collective bargaining amongst freelancers. And we're supportive of that idea in general, and we're interested in seeing where it goes. But there has been no legal way to do that. The Graphic Artists Guild puts out a book, which is sort of like the Bible of our industry, called the Pricing and Ethical Guidelines. We survey pricing about every 2-3 years. We put out these tables of like, this is the average of what people charge for this, that, and the other. And there's like literally hundreds of different examples, different types of projects, different sizes of clients, different specs of the projects. But all we can do is publish the averages and let people take their own conclusions about what to charge. We can't tell them this is what you should charge, and we can't collectively bargain to say this is now the going rate for such and such a thing, because it is not legal for us to do that.
Other thoughts from the other panelists on this question, and whether artists and designers would be better served by unions if they existed than they are served by trade associations now?
Yeah,
I can't really speak on this, but I do think that it touches onto the idea that college students understanding the implications of some of these choices and some of these economic conditions is like what prepares them to make that choice. Like they have to be prepared to make that choice and understand what the implications are for choosing a union versus a trade association. And they can do that if they've had exposure to that, the context and the history of some of these situations, throughout the past. Because that's something that, like, when I teach in a design thinking class, we talk about sustainability and the working conditions that produce a specific product. are part of the analysis of our case study, is like understanding the implications. So if you're, you know, a freelancer or a student who's pricing stuff really low, you know, what are the implications for your peers in the industry for that? So I think it kind of comes back to the implications, but I think I may have stepped on May's toes. She had a comment.
Go ahead, May.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, because I really believe that it is the worker's choice to make, but it needs to be an informed choice. So I really agree with what you're saying. I think the collective bargaining model is good for the industrial workplace. And if workers are looking for like group benefits and things like that, the collective bargaining contract had some legal authority to codify requirements related to those issues. And I saw a question in the chat from a friend of mine, Joy, asking whether unions in the fashion industry represent workers other than production. And this is something that I always thought would be a good idea, but the way that union would have to be quite different, because the workplace rights, benefits, and treatment of the different employees in the industry are different. And, you know, unions or workers have to bargain from that point of what they need and and then also what type of organization. So unions right now are changing and evolving quite a lot, because the workplace is really changing, and the nature of workers' relationships to work, to employers, and so on has really changed. There's such a big rise in gig workers and, you know, jobs that are not a traditional like workplace where there's a boss and there's workers and people work regular hours. So yeah, I think it's a very fluid question, but I think workers should have that collective right to band together and figure that out for each industry and for each workplace.
Yeah, there's two things I want to say to what May is saying. One, I think that you are alluding to something that Josh Freeman actually alluded to this morning, which is the old debate over whether we should organize based on craft or workplace. Craft unionism versus industrial unionism, which I will not bore all of the students in the room with. But the basic idea is the way that we choose which workers go into which organizations, which unions, is an incredibly important question and can lead to the success or failure of the labor movement. The other thing I wanted to say in relation to Joy's question is, yes, there is one union that represents workers on processes outside of production. It's my union, the United College Employees of FIT, which represents people who train people to be fashion designers. I wish that the UCE of FIT did more to encourage other areas of non-production to unionize, because I think that designers could really use a union also. And with that in mind, we actually have to wrap up, because those of us who are members of the United College Employees of FIT have to go to a union meeting right now to see how our labor negotiations are going. So you'll see on the program, there are some breakout rooms. If people want to go to breakout rooms and chat with each other a little bit more, or stay in this room a little bit longer, that's okay with me. But I'm going, and I think Kyung-hee's going to go, and all the other FIT faculty are going to leave, and all of my students are going to leave because time is up. But we'll see you tomorrow. We've got a lot of really great programming tomorrow. We hope that some of you come back for more. Thank you all so much. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to everybody. It's been a lot of fun.